Thanks very much. Just to start off with is to introduce myself as a journalist, not as a specialist in this subject at all. This is a very technical subject and one that technical specialists within government, within Eskom, within the municipalities are grappling with daily. It's a difficult subject because we've had an electricity pricing policy in place which hasn't really been implemented as envisaged when it was first put in place as the electricity crisis started to unfold. So the big caveat is my non-expertise. It's really a narrative. I'm not a shaper of this, I'm a narrator of this. So I would like that to be very clear. Secondly, I'd like just to jump straight into the background to an electricity pricing policy. And really, the background is South Africa's electricity crisis, which has persisted now for over a decade. We've got intensifying load shedding, steeply rising tariffs, high levels of theft, massive payment backlogs from municipalities to Eskom, from citizens to municipalities, aging, unreliable and dirty assets. We need significant investment to get ourselves out of this and to clean up our Electricity Act. We've got steeply rising prices or tariffs over the 15 years, more than 300% in real terms. Yet Eskom, and this is an important point, remains financially unsustainable. Without the ongoing fiscal injections, which we saw continuation of in last week's budget, which is taxpayer support, the Eskom is not a viable entity, is not a going concern. So we're basically needing to inject that money in. And that's partly because of this pricing policy, which hasn't actually caught up to the point where we had low tariffs for far too long and far too low, and they haven't really caught up. And therefore, Eskom remains in backlog in terms of cost reflectivity. And then, of course, there is this caveat around corruption and how much has been lost to that. But I think even if you were to take a very liberal view of how much corruption has eaten into Eskom's margins, I don't think it would account for the gap, the delta between the price and what their costs are. The good news is that South Africa has potent renewable resources. These are now the cheapest form of new generation. New generation, I want to underline, because we hear a lot about nuclear being the cheapest. Nuclear is the cheapest in the fleet, but if you were to build new nuclear, it's not going to be the cheapest by a long shot. And obviously variable renewable energy in the form of solar and wind needs to be backed up or complemented with storage. And even once you do that, backing it up with the legacy coal fleet initially, with the battery energy storage, with pump storage, and with some gas, I think that's what the policy is saying. That is still going to be our cheapest, least cost, future new build mix. The industry structure is being changed to reflect these changes in and the need for investment. Eskom's being unbundled to accommodate these major technological shifts. The just energy transition is an opportunity to create new jobs and industries in South Africa, and some support is being offered as we progress down that line in the form of $8.5 billion, which needs to be, it's an offer that needs to be translated into transactions. But so why do we have an electricity pricing policy? It's really shaped by our electricity policy of 1998, which, as we know, was never implemented, but remains our policy. So we have it because we want improved social equity by addressing the requirements of low-income consumers. We want enhanced efficiency and competitiveness so that we can have a low-cost, high-quality outcome. We want environmental sustainability, and we want to use our natural resources wisely. We want the right to choose an electricity supplier. This is a major shift. We've always had a monopoly structure, competition, especially in the generation sector, to try and bring down costs. We want an open and non-discriminatory transmission system. This was all said back in 1998, by the way. This is not new. We are going to encourage private sector participation in the industry. We want to ensure that electrification targets are met. As we know, some South Africans are still not connected to electricity networks, whether those are networks as in the big integrated grid or more and more probably microgrids, because it's very difficult to get to certain areas cost effectively. We want a financially viable sector, which we don't have. As I mentioned earlier, Eskom remains probably the biggest risk to South Africa's fiscal sustainability. We want an improved quality of service and supply, including security of supply, which we don't have. We want proper coordination of operations and investments, and we want to attract and retain a competent workforce in the sector. But what is shaping this underlying transition that's underway? And it's really the 4Ds. This is what's shaping not only South Africa's transition, but the global energy transition, especially in the electricity sector. We want decarbonisation is the key D, and we saw that was a big focus of last year with the Glasgow summit. And South Africa was actually one of the darlings of that summit, in that we were able to blend our just transition work with the work that Eskom had done, as well as a fairly progressive, nationally determined contribution to knock on an open door, because the developed world were looking for some sort of place to show their credibility in terms of helping with mitigation actions. We now have the offer of 8.5 billion. That offer needs to be converted into transactions. That's some way off, and there's a lot of political resistance, which I think is unfounded and misdirected, but be that as it may, that there is a lot of resistance. There's this decentralization trend. This means that we used to have a very centralized network, so the coal-fired power stations dominated up in the northeast of the country, transmitted through major high-voltage transmission lines to the rest of the country. We're now going to see a massive decentralization with renewable energy, the best resources being on the coast or in the Northern Cape. So there will have to be a way of transporting and evacuating that new electricity into different locations. But with decentralization, there will be a period where we have to rely on the legacy grid, which is really located in Mpumalanga. And that's why the just energy transition investments initially are going to be located in that Mpumalanga province. They have to be. That's where the grid is available. It might not be our best resources in terms of renewables resources, but because we can't evacuate it from the northern, western and eastern Cape, we need to start where the grid is located, and that's in Mpumalanga. Digitalisation is shaping everything, not only in the electricity and energy systems, but in every system, from finance to the way we buy our groceries. And there's the democratization theme that is underway as well, which allows, previously this was a utility game, now more and more individuals, both businesses and households, can play a direct role in generation. So these are having an impact. These technologies are facilitating a transition from coal to renewables. The industry structure has to change from vertical integration to greater decentralization, and therefore a separated industry structure where you have generation, transmission, distribution in separate businesses, and that is happening at Eskom as we speak. In addition, the current pricing framework, has not delivered stable and predictable prices, and is not really catering for the changes that need to come, because as you integrate more variable renewable technologies and you need to back that up, it is important to have correct charging for that service. So energy charges is what we used to, kilowatt hours on our bill, but more and more, if we are going to be self-generators and we're going to rely on the grid as a backup, as our battery, we need to pay for that. So we need to also have capacity charges integrated in. And you can see that starting to happen in some of our billing as we speak. So what are the principles guiding the new EPP? And this new EPP is really in draft format. It's a big, thick, gazetted document. And it's much thicker than the original one, but really the principles that it must enable the efficient licensee, be that Eskom, be that IPPs, to recover the full cost of their license activities and a reasonable margin or return, that's cost reflectivity, must provide for prescribed incentives for continued improvements and efficiency, so sending the correct investment signals to both the utility company, the transmission company, the distributors, and IPPs to get that investment going and in the right places at the right cost. Must give users proper information regarding the costs of their consumption. So we want transparency, as I was mentioning. We don't just have volumes of energy coming to us, we've got the grid playing a backup role, and that needs to be transparently costed. We must avoid undue discrimination between customer categories, and so that's non-discrimination as a principle. And there is still the need for social protection in the form of cross-subsidies to certain customers. So what are the major points that emerge in this draft document, which is still a draft, and there's going to be a comment process, and the networks that I'm in, that I have some visibility of the expert networks. I'm just a journalist, as I mentioned earlier. There's definitely a view that this can be tidied up. There were two major documents put out on the same day by Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe, this being one and the other being the amendment to the Electricity Regulation Act. Both seem to be directionally correct, but really do need to be neatened up. It seems even the spell check went missing in certain instances. But anyway, some of the major points that are coming up in the draft is that it continues to emphasize the principle of cost-reflective tariffs, and it says that this should happen in 5 years. Now, we must remember that the previous EPP said that this should happen in 3 years, and it never did happen. And therefore, we have ongoing fiscal injections into the utility Eskom. The EPP also takes account of an unbundled electricity sector, as I was mentioning, caters for wheeling costs. These are quite important because where you have to evacuate electricity where it's far away from load centers. So, for instance, you're in Cape Town, the best resource is in Northern Cape. You want to transmit that electricity as an IPP to a Cape Town customer, you need to wheel it across the network, both the Eskom network and possibly the municipal network, and those wheeling charges need to be put in place. And that has been a bit of an impediment to investment in recent past. It emphasizes competition, especially at the level of generation. The way we're going to break the system down is generation is going to be a highly competitive space. The natural monopoly is in the wires business, that is in the transmission company that is starting to be unbundled from Eskom. And then we're going to have multiple distributing companies. This is mostly through municipalities. We tried in the past to restructure that industry because in many ways it's emerging as the weakest link. As much as Eskom's a weak link, the distributors are becoming a weak link too. And we tried that REDS consolidation, but that was found to be unconstitutional. But we need to find a way of having very sound distributing companies, because that could really become a problem in the future. The current encourages efficient use of electricity. This is important, including in the context of climate change, also sending the right signals, when you're using your electricity at a time of day that everyone is trying to use it. So through time of use tariffs, this is an important signal to consumers not to try and shift the usages to times when it's less deleterious, to less expensive for the system. So those are important. So it emphasizes that. It points to a transition in the billing framework, as I mentioned, to reflect the real costs of the system, not just the electricity, but the backup that you are getting from the grid. It reinforces the notion of a free basic electricity concept, and then outlines the conditions for cross-subsidies. So this is a bit cheeky of me. So I've come to the end of really analyzing the document, but what are the issues for the church as we analyze this important document that's in the public domain? And I'd say earlier in my slide, you would have noticed I highlighted some of the issues that came out of that 1998 white paper. but those were highlighted for a reason, because these are the social justice objectives. This is to improve equity by addressing the requirements for low-income consumers, having an environmentally sustainable system, ensuring that electrification targets are met. These are people that are not yet in the system. So there's also this issue of financial viability, which I've put in there, even though it's not a clear social justice concern. If we don't have that, that basic building block or foundational block, then everything else is going to collapse. Improve the quality of service and attract and retain a competent workforce. So I'd say many of these objectives are being addressed in other places, the EPP being one. There's the amendments to the Electricity Regulation Act, which is also out for public comment at the moment. There's changes underway at Eskom, which are aligned to this transition. And there's also instruments such as the carbon tax and the environmental levy. So from the EPP perspective, the areas that could receive some focus from the church is how do we improve social equity by addressing the requirements for low-income consumers. And there's really two elements of the big document that could be interrogated a bit further, and I'm not an expert on either, but it's something that you could maybe seek advice on. The one is on free basic electricity. I think it's important that the document underlines that concept and says it should be retained. It supports free basic FBE, but it notes that there are certain application problems, and it proposes to remedy these by more intense monitoring. But there may need to be more. There was recent research by Dr. Tracy Ledger, which showed that in the 6 financial years from 2014-15 to 2019-20, 38.3 billion was dispersed by the National Treasury in the form of free basic electricity to indigent households. But this failed to reach the recipients. I think that paper might be worth looking at. It was called Broken Promises. So I think it's an important concept that's retained, so it should be supported, but maybe there needs to be some meat on the bones of how this thing's going to be monitored so that it really gets to the intended recipients. It's not at the moment. And then there's the other issue of cross subsidies. The EPP says the provision of cross subsidies for low-income domestic customers is a foregone conclusion, and it is expected that this would be a requirement for at least the next 10 years. So that's embedded in the document. But this is my point. It might be worthwhile seeking expert advice on whether these cross subsidies would be better weighted, could be better weighted in favor of poor households and or activities with high employment multipliers in the context of our very steep unemployment rates. So my conclusion is secure and affordable electricity supply is crucial for growth, development, and job creation. We all know that. We've all experienced the downsides of not having affordable and secure. Producing and transporting electricity carries a cost. The EPP should ensure that a balance is struck between covering those costs sustainably, including by incentivizing new investment and ensuring affordability to the most vulnerable. And then my point is any relief through the tariff or through fiscal support. So maybe the tariff is not the best mechanism. Sometimes it's better to have direct fiscal support to poor households. That should be both transparent, but also heavily weighted in favor of poor households or job-intensive activities. So that's my 2 cents, not expert, but more narrative than shaping, as I mentioned earlier. I hope that is helpful.